So hopefully you have a Bible, and go grab a Bible if you do not, and open up to Mark chapter 9, and we are starting in verse 30. And the focus of this message is what I am calling Ministry Matters. So we are going to pick up the story where we left off last week. Now, if you remember, a couple weeks ago, we talked about the Transfiguration. Jesus was up on the mountain. He was there with Peter, James, and John. The Holy Spirit came down and changed Jesus, so his appearance was glowing, and his clothes changed colors as well to a dazzling white. And Elijah was there, and Moses was there, and the disciples, these three disciples were there, and it was literally a mountaintop experience where they saw Jesus in a fuller sense of who he was. And the voice of the Father said, "This is my beloved Son, whom I'm chosen, who I love. Listen to him." Now, after that experience, they went down the mountain. And as they went down the mountain, at the base of the mountain, there were the other disciples arguing with the scribes. And those disciples were unable to help deliver a boy from a demon, and there was an argument that took place. Jesus taught them and said, you have to be prepared by being God's presence through prayer in order to deal with this. He commanded the demon to flee, had a conversation with the dad, and then they continued on. So we're picking up the story this week, again, Mark chapter 9, verse 30, from that point. And from our passage today, okay, I want you to see again what Jesus came to do. I want you to understand what you are to do in order to be great in the eyes of heaven. And also, we're going to see what legitimate ministry is all about. So that is the 3 points of today, and we're going to start with the first one. It's here up on the screen, the mission of Jesus. Now, in this section of Mark, Jesus tells his disciples 3 times what he's going to do. And each time, the disciples get it a little stronger. First time, Peter rebukes Jesus. This time, they were quiet. But Jesus gave them some more details, which we're going to take a look at in just a moment. So here we are, Mark chapter 9, starting with verse 30. And they went on from there and passed through Galilee. And he, that's Jesus, did not want anyone to know. For he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And when he's killed, after 3 days, he will rise. But they did not understand the saying, and were afraid to ask him. Okay, so at this point, Jesus' direct goal was to go to Jerusalem, be betrayed, be tortured, and be killed and rise again. So he was bringing his disciples along with him. And his time of significant public ministry had come to a close. He was focusing in on training them and equipping them for what was going to happen in Jerusalem, but also what was going to happen after he rose again and ascended to heaven, equipping them for their ministry that they would continue in the message and in the methods of Christ. So Jesus didn't want to draw a crowd, and so they were going incognito, so to speak, trying to go throughout the countryside to eventually go down to Jerusalem. And so they were quietly passing through the countryside. And as they were going, Jesus was teaching them. And we don't know all that he taught them at that time. However, the primary point is recorded for us. He was teaching them that the Son of Man, and he often called himself that name. We can see that in Daniel chapter 7. So the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. Now, this was a change from what he originally told them the first time, okay? And this is a significant point because it wasn't that the Roman soldiers were just going to come and find him, grab him, and take him. It wasn't that the Pharisees or the scribes were just going to come in by force and just, rush in again. It wasn't going to be that way. that Jesus was going to be delivered over to them, given to them, or betrayed to his accusers. So in saying this, he was telling them that someone is going to turn me over to the people who want to kill me. What's also very, very interesting, and this is a good point for us to remember, that Jesus at this time just had the 12 disciples around him. Jesus knew who was going to betray him. It wasn't a mystery to Jesus, because we see that at the Last Supper, that when he tells Judas Iscariot to go and do what you've come to do, Jesus knew who was going to do it. What's curious to me and fascinating, it's a fantastic point for each one of us, is to know that none of the other disciples knew who it was. And I'm not even sure that Judas fully comprehended what he was going to do at this point. Jesus knew, but no one else did. So, know what that tells us? That Jesus treated each and every one of them the same way. The same compassion and friendship he offered to Peter, James, and John, he offered to every one of those disciples, including Judas Iscariot. Now, I don't know about you, right? If I knew that someone in my close inner circle was going to betray me, someone was going to cause me great harm, twist my words, and turn me over to be killed and tortured and to be humiliated and all of that Jesus was going through, I personally would be a little leery of that person. But Jesus treated everyone the same. And this is a good note for each and every one of us as well. In your fulfilling your calling to be like Christ, you and I must love and care for people all the same. Not just giving the best of us to those who will love us and treat us well, but also to give the same love, check this out, to everyone, even and especially to those who mean to do us harm. That's hard, right? Look around your room and say, yeah, that's hard. That is hard. It's hard for me, right? It's hard for us because our fallen nature wants to eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. This is not the mission and ministry of Jesus, and this is not the spirit in which we are to interact with people around us as well, right? We are to love and to give ourselves fully and heartily to everyone, especially to those who intend to do us wrong. And Scripture will point to this in several different places. Now, the disciples, in hearing what Jesus had to say, had a hard time accepting the hard truth of what Jesus was telling them was going to happen. He ended up having to tell them the same truth over and over for them to grasp the reality of it. And the same is true for us. If the truth is something that we are strongly opposed to, we have a hard time to receive the truth. And we will fight against anything that does not line up with what we think is reality, especially when the truth is contrary to what we want. This was true of them, and this is true of us. So check yourself on what is true and what is not. As Jesus was leading them towards Capernaum on the way to Jerusalem to be betrayed by one of them, to suffer and give his life for them, guess what they were doing, right? So Jesus was marching down there. He was going to freely give himself over and for his children and to his enemies. His disciples were arguing among themselves who was the greatest among them. What a contrast to what Jesus was doing and what his disciples were focusing in on. So this is our next point. The greatest among you. And this, again, is significant for us. This is Mark chapter 9, starting with verse 33. And they came to Capernaum. And when he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you discussing along the way?" But they kept silent. For on the way, they had argued with one another about who was the greatest. And he sat down and called the 12. And he said to them, "If anyone would be first, he must be last of all and servant of all." And he took a child and put him in the midst of them. And taking him in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. And whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me." Okay, this is important. So they finally made their way to Capernaum, and they gathered into a house. And we know that Peter and Andrew had a house there, and perhaps this was their house. And Jesus asked them a question about what they've been talking about along the way. Now, obviously, he knew what they were arguing about, and he needed to address the subject with them. And instead of just going right at them, he asked them a question. And in asking them a question, it made them think about what they were saying and also take ownership of the focus of their conversation. No one answered the questions because it's safe to guess that after they had thought about it, they didn't want to admit what they had been talking about. Approach does matter, especially when there's need of a conversation to bring correction. And it would be good for each one of us to think about our approach in sensitive conversations as well. Most of the time, we want to be seen as right or better. And the approach of Jesus is that we would see the truth and then align ourselves with it. Think about Jesus' way of confronting and connecting and confronting people, and do likewise. So Jesus sat down and he addressed them as a group, because the conversation had been had by them all, and they are all affected by it, and they all needed to be corrected for it. And then Jesus radically transforms their quest for greatness. He said, "If anyone would be first, he must be last of all and servant of all." He says, true greatness is not wanting to be first while others are second and third and fourth. But true greatness is the willingness to be last. And true greatness is not positioning yourself so that others praise you, but true greatness is putting yourself in a position to serve everyone, to be a blessing to as many as you possibly can. So Jesus doesn't condemn the quest for greatness. He radically transforms it. He says, go ahead and pursue it, but the path is down, not up. The measure of true greatness is to what degree has the impulse of self-glorification been crucified in yourself? How much heartfelt desire to serve others has there been in you? Do you serve them because it serves you? Or are you and do you serve others out of a humble heart for them and out of a love for God? How much readiness and willingness to decrease do you possess while others increase? We have to be careful to use the measure of greatness that God uses than to judge with the measure of greatness the world uses. Now, the world in our flesh typically says this, that the more people who serve you and follow you and talk about you, the more you have, the greater you are. If you have more likes on Facebook, if you have more followers on Instagram, if people know you wherever you go, therefore you are great. If you have money and yachts and properties and lands and positions and powers and possessions and all of these things, in the eyes of the world, that person is a success. That person is great. That person is whom I want to be like. Jesus again turns it on its head. Says, that's not success in my sight. I want to tell you that God's opinion and God's measuring stick for success is far more important than any person on this planet, whoever was, who is, and whoever will be. This is the measure of success that I want you to possess and go for and aim at. To be servant of all, and choosing to be lowest and to be least and to be last, to bless and benefit others in the glory of God. God measures success by the more you give, the more you serve, the more you look like Christ, and then the greater you are. Judge by right judgment, by the right standard. Jesus told us in John chapter 7, verse 24, do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment. That's hard to do because we're naturally inclined to judge by appearances, what it looks like, what we see. But God not only sees all of these things, but he sees what's most important, what's in the heart, the motives, and the desires, and what's really happening. So don't judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment. Paul also gives us this reminder as well in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 5. He says, therefore, do not pronounce judgment before the time. Don't say, yep, they're successful. Well, they're not successful, right? Don't pronounce judgment before the time. There will be a time in which true greatness will be revealed before the Lord comes, who will bring to light the things now hidden in darkness, and will disclose the purposes of the heart. Then each one will receive his or her commendation from God. Now think about those verses and be very careful what you call a success and failure. You don't know all the facts, and you don't see the whole picture. At that time, a time in the future, God will bring all things to light, even the motives of the heart And at that time, and at that point, each person will receive his reward, her reward in honor from God. So the wise person works and lives for the honor of that day. Not for the honor of men to be seen successful in their eyes. Looking to be successful in God's eyes. And this is a scary corrective passage for each one of us. And I don't know what you're pursuing, and I don't know how you define success. But I'm going to let you know right now, please define success as how God defines success. Are you working to become like Christ? Are you giving yourself to serve other people with a genuine and a sincere heart? Do you only do your works of righteousness so that other people can see you and that the people that you like will like you and to get something back? Or are you quietly, subtly, consistently serving all people? You can fool people, but I'm telling you, you will not fool God. So we'll see what really is a success. We'll know a lot more 100 years from now, okay? When we're all on the other side. So live your life with that in mind. Now, Jesus went on to illustrate his point even farther with a child. Now, this discussion wasn't about children. So why does Jesus bring them in? The answer is that there's no political payback in serving children. They can't vote. There's no financial gain from children, right? They're not going to pay you for this, or they're not going to, open up their lake cabin to you. Right? You don't get financial gain from children. There's no social clout you're going to gain from them. And children don't give speeches about how great is your helpfulness. And then rarely, if ever, right, thank you for it. In fact, children pretty much take for granted that you'll take care of them. They don't make a big deal out of it, of the fact that you pour your life out for them. And so, children prove more clearly, I think, than any other kind of people, whether you are truly great or not. Whether you live to serve or live to be praised. Jesus also taught in Luke 14, 12 through 14, that if you want a reward from God, then serve those who will not serve you back. Give to those who cannot give back to you. Honor those who are dishonored in the world. This is how you will be great in the eyes of God. And God will reward you for this. People clamor after the rich and famous, right? If someone famous came in here, everyone will be fawning over them. You see this all the time when celebrities or rich people or whatever come into a place, all eyes turn, and everyone wants to please this person, right? What about the servant? What about the maid? What about the waiter? What about the people who cut your lawn? What about your neighbors? What about the people who can give you nothing back? Your measure of your greatness is not how you treat those who you consider great, but your measure of greatness is measured by how you treat those who are the least. Turns it on its head. If you truly want to be great, which I hope you do in God's sight, then do what Jesus instructed us to do. Do what Jesus did himself. Gave himself in service out of love to everyone, including the lonely, the lost, the least, the left out, even his enemies. Now, another great example of this, remember this? When Jesus washed the feet of his disciples, right? The disciples were still thinking they were a pretty big deal. And they went to the upper room. This is right before Jesus was going to be given over or betrayed. And they've been walking all day, and their feet were dirty and dusty and damp. Maybe they're a little sweaty, and it's kind of gross, right? And so they gathered together, and they kind of looked around. It's like, hey, who's going to wash our feet? Where's the servants here? And Jesus quietly slipped away, grabbed the bowl or whatever, and started to wash their feet. It was a shocking example and a right example of what he was saying. He just didn't say it, he put it into action. This is how you are to be great. So are you washing anybody's feet? Who are you taking care of? Who are you looking after? How are you treating the workers at the store? How are you treating those in your home? How are you treating those that you are connected to? Please aim for greatness and do it in a way that God acknowledges. And so this was a fitting lesson for the disciples and equipping them in their ministry. And it is a fitting lesson for us, right? That we recognize what Jesus did and how he treated everyone with love and respect and care and honor and the same compassion. Even his enemies. It's a great lesson for us as to, if you want to be great, okay, but this is how you do it. It's descending into greatness. Take it to heart. Make changes now when you still have time to be more like Christ and to be truly great in God's sight. Now, the conversation continued. And this is the last point. We're going to talk about legitimate ministry, right? And it's interesting, and it's an issue for us who are pastors and us who are church-going people of thinking that our group is better than that group and their group. And if you're a part of us, you're legitimate. But if you're a part of another group, then not so much. And Jesus addresses it to them, and he addresses it to us as well. So check this out. This is Mark chapter 9, starting with verse 38. John said to him, this was the disciple John, said to Jesus, "Teacher, we saw someone casting out demons in your name. And we tried to stop him because he was not following us," right? He wasn't a part of our group. He was casting out demons. And we're like, whoa. You can't do that, right? Stop what you're doing right now. Right? But Jesus said, "Don't stop him. For no one who does a mighty work in my name will be able soon afterwards to speak evil of me. For the one who is not against us is for us. For truly I say to you, whoever gives you a cup of water to drink because you belong to Christ will by no means lose his or her reward." And so again, Jesus noticed, right? And John was trying to stop someone who was trying to casting out a demon, right? He said, "Don't do this because you're not a part of our group." And tragically, this happens yet today. Again, we think that in order for our ministry to be legitimate, it must be done by our group. And if someone in a different group and of a different theological persuasion, right? The Episcopalians or the Lutherans or the Baptists or the Pentecostals or the whatever, right? We think, well, they're just a little off, so therefore they're a little bit not as good as us. And churches have this issue all the time, right? And Jesus says, hey, listen, if they're doing work in my name, right? Acknowledge it. Don't stop them because they're not against me. And they are for me. And they're not going to speak evil of me if they're doing their ministry in my name. So embrace what they're doing that is good and true and wholesome. So often we like to dice it up and slice it up and say, well, we're better than them. And it's a false and faulty and destructive religious pride that causes problems. So be grateful for the ministry that is being done in your community and in the world by other groups, and acknowledge what they're doing. And let them do it. and support them and the good that they are doing. Right? That doesn't mean that doctrine doesn't matter. It does matter, and we should discuss it. But remember the motivation. Motivation matters. And theological positions, yes, of course. But at least we are to applaud and acknowledge the good that other groups are doing, right? And not fall for the lie that, well, what we do is legitimate and what they do is a little suspect. Hear this message, right? And ultimately, God will determine who and what is rewarded. Don't fool yourself in thinking everything you do and everything we do is better than what they do or that person does. God ultimately is the judge. And he's the one who says what is successful in his sight. So we're going to conclude this message, and we are going to shift into a time of communion. And I hope the Holy Spirit has highlighted a few things from our time together in the Word today. And here are, again, some of the key points I want you to take away from our message today. In following after Jesus, make sure you treat all people like Christ, regardless if they will betray and hurt you. Okay? That's key. And some of you, some of us, myself included, need to grab on to that. Treat each and every person as Christ would and as a ministry to Christ. And following after Jesus, make sure to serve all people. Serve all people. Give special attention to those who cannot give you anything back in return. And following after Jesus, make sure to make a right judgment, right? But who and what is successful or not. Know that God is the one who has the final say. And live to be a success in his eyes. Jesus said, greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his or her life for their friends. John 15:13. So, be about the business of laying down your life for the benefit and service of others, because you love God, and God loves them. And this is what Jesus did for us. He taught us these things, but he demonstrated these things as well. And he literally laid his life down for us.